Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchant, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. Welcome back, Tim.
Yes, Happy New Year and happy new budget proposal.
That's right. So the governor just came out with his new budget for the next fiscal year, and we've got our all-star experts, including Wayne Winegarden, Senior Fellow in Business and Economics. He's going to talk about the budget. PRI's President Sally Pipes on healthcare, Lance Izumi, Senior Director of Education, on education spending, and Steve Smith, our Senior Fellow in California Reform on public safety. But first, Tim, let's set it up and talk about the big picture here. So some of our listeners know that the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office came out with an earlier budget deficit estimate of $68 billion. The governor's office believes it's going to be a lot less, $38 billion. And that's, this is the second year in a row that the state's that the states had to deal with deficits. Last year, I think it was about 20-something billion, $22 billion. Newsom's budget is less than last year's, $291.5 billion. That's down about $20 million, I think. And he's proposing, cuts in some areas, dipping into the rainy day fund, about $13 billion. And the rest, looks like he's going to delay it. So, Tim, what's your initial take on it?
Well, who would have thought that a dust-up with the Legislative Analyst's Office would be the main headline of the budget press conference? For those of you who were have your budget drinking game at home and were curious, the governor spoke for a little over 100 minutes in his budget presentation this year. So brief for the governor, who's been known to go on for over 2 hours in some presentations. I think that I was thinking about this, about the budget presentation. Obviously, a lot of this is about politics. So, yes, a governor's entitled to have his own economist, his own economic outlook, his own estimate of revenue. Every governor does that. But it's usually kind of within the ballpark of what the legislative analyst says. And remember, the legislative analyst is notoriously cautious and notoriously realistic. It really is the gold standard estimate. And so Newsom trying to kind of have it, it kind of calls into question the seriousness and soundness of the budget overall, and especially when it comes to getting spending under control, which we'll get into with Wayne a little bit later. But I think there's a political reason why he did it, and why he did it to that amount. In 2008 or 9, when I worked in the legislature, when I worked for Assembly Republican leader Mike Valines at the time, we were in the midst of the worst state budget crisis in state history. We had a $42 or $3 billion budget deficit. And remember, the general fund was a lot less there. So this crisis percentage-wise was like half the state budget. And we literally were on the brink of the state going bankrupt. And I think that he revised the deficit number to under that amount. So he doesn't have the albatross of, I ran up the largest deficit in state history on my watch. Could be crass politics, crass political thinking on my part, but I think that's probably what's at play in him having a much lower deficit number. The other thing that I think is interesting, now we have had, of course, the response from the legislative analyst to this whole issue, and the legislative analyst says that the Newsom estimate is about $15 billion higher on the revenue side than they project, and they say that the Newsom administration is more optimistic than their projection. However, they believe it's in the outer range of the most optimistic, plausible projections. So I think that's the legislative analyst being diplomatic and not wanting to say the governor's out to lunch here. But take for that what you will. We will have a more detailed analysis from the legislative analyst sometime next week. So that's kind of where I think Newsom is, has his head around. He always has to tick the box on everything. And I think he wanted to make darn sure he didn't have the worst deficit in state history on his watch, even though clearly we do.
And Tim, you actually listened to the whole thing. So there was a bit of dust up with the Wall Street Journal during the press conference.
Yes, is interesting. I thought, watching Newsom's presentation overall, that he seemed to have an aura of, you all should be grateful to me for the wonderful budget that I have. Even admonished reporters, I hope you start writing about the budget in the deficit number that I've dictated, like they're his students. And then he said, when you're talking about the budget and characterizing it, you should describe it in terms of the resilience in how we have approached state budgeting, which I'm sure met with collective groans in the room. But one of the more interesting things, and, I think Newsom was more, a lot of things got under his collar in this presentation today, is the fight over the wealth tax. For our listeners who may not have been following, Assemblyman Alex Lee has a proposal to create a wealth tax in California. It's not going anywhere, but it actually is going to face a legislative hearing. And, that's a refreshing change with our new Assembly Speaker, Robert Rivas, versus, our former Speaker, Anthony Rendon, who would deny things, committee hearings. And so the Wall Street Journal, not surprisingly, put out a pretty scathing editorial criticizing the proposal and, calling on the governor to veto it. Well, that got under the governor's skin, and he called out reporters, for asking about it, and went off on the Wall Street Journal editorial board for writing about it, in effect saying, what are you wasting your time asking me about this or writing about this? This isn't going to go anywhere. And so I think he's very sensitive to the Newsom is the embodiment of kind of California legislative craziness, and obviously a wealth tax proposal, and as envisioned by Assemblyman Lee, is kind of the embodiment of California legislative craziness. But I thought it really showed, this is a guy who doesn't like to be held accountable, doesn't like to be asked tough questions. And obviously that criticism of him on taxes got under his skin big time.
Well, I want to get your take on how the Dems in the legislature are going to feel about this. They're going to want to protect their pet programs, especially programs where the unions have had a big say. How much cooperation do you think Newsom is going to get, especially now with this new speaker, Speaker Rivas? Would that make a difference? What's your take on that?
And also, don't forget, we're going to have a new Senate president on February 5th with Mike McGuire. I think what's good for Newsom is that Speaker Rivas and Senate Pro Tem to be McGuire, though they're both, I think they would both call themselves liberals, but they're pragmatic deal makers. So I think they are temperamentally going to want to work with Newsom as much as possible, be as cooperative with Newsom as possible. That is very helpful to him. However, liberal legislators, this new End Poverty in California caucus, they may cause some headaches for the speaker and the pro tem, because even though Newsom didn't cut as much as he should have, even though there's a lot of deferrals and delays and gimmicks that mask necessary spending cuts, even this might be too much for some of the legislature's liberals. So Newsom probably will face some budget heartburn, especially if April tax receipts don't go as well as they are clearly hoping for. Now, I will say on kind of the change in the speakership, and, the speaker, of course, sets the tone for his caucus. Listen to what Speaker Rivas said in responding to the budget. He said, quote, the Assembly Democratic Caucus is committed to fiscal restraint and spending oversight while delivering solutions to improve the quality of life for all Californians and protecting the most vulnerable. Well, they certainly haven't in years shown much commitment at all to oversight, which our Wayne Winegarden has argued is more important than ever before, especially in a year like this. And certainly, Democrats in the legislature have not shown any fiscal constraint by any stretch of the imagination. So those kind of words are probably music to Newsom's ears, that lawmakers are going to be more helpful this year than the past few years when passing a budget has proved more difficult.
So, Tim, it's going to be a very interesting budget year ahead. And to do a deeper dive into the budget, we have next Wayne Winegarden, who is our Senior Director of Business and Economics. And here's Wayne. Wayne, the governor just released his 2024-2025 state budget proposal. Even though it's the size of a phone book, you've actually had a chance to review it, the key features, right? Wayne. So let's start with an overview question. Based on your initial read, what are some of the key provisions in the governor's approach to closing the deficit that caught your attention and should be more heavily scrutinized? And what are some items that, in your view, were shortchanged by the governor?
Sure. Yeah, it is about as interesting as reading the phone book, right? But not nearly as educational. Well, if we start with the deficit, and that's a big controversy right now, the governor says it's about $38 billion, 37.8 billion to be precise. And there's reasons to be skeptical of that number. The GAO, I'm sorry, the GAO, the LAO, when they looked at it, they said it was about $68 billion. Now, there's income tax data, revenue data that apparently only the governor has. But when you compare that to some of the other numbers that are coming in, it's not adding up. But let's not worry about that because a $38 billion deficit is one of the largest in history. That in and of itself, is a barn burner. So let's take that number, $38 billion deficit. That's the problem we're dealing with. He's not dealing with that huge problem in a sustainable way. He's making eight and a half, so eight and a half out of $38 billion actual budget. And many of those, like some of that, he's reducing spending on the climate. And clearly, his first chance he gets, he's going to try to ramp that spending back up. So that even the cuts he's making, they're not sustainable cuts. And then he also is, and would do the right thing to do, he's making withdrawals from the rainy day funds. That can make sense. But we need obviously the spending control in order to make that worthwhile. But it does make sense to on the withdrawals. But the remainder of it, more than half of it, are all budget gimmicks, internal borrowing. He is delaying projects, shifting funds around, referring projects, which apparently referring a project is different than delaying a project. Again, only government accountant can come up with that differentiation. So the problem with the budget is there's a huge spending problem. He's not addressing that spending problem. Spending problem has created a deficit, and he's using gimmicks to overcome that. And it's not a long-term sustainable budget.
Well, despite your admonition, let's dive in a little more into deficit gate here. So, you've had a chance to look at the governor's numbers and the numbers that the LAO put out. So, who do you think is right here? And I guess a bigger picture question, why would the administration go out of their way to project a different deficit number than the LAO? I mean, it would seem like quite a big risk to base a budget that isn't really on, well, certainly commonly agreed to numbers, but the reality of what we're dealing with in the, revenue and spending pictures for the state.
Yeah, well, to the first question in terms of reliability, I had mentioned the controller has numbers that come in, right? They put out a report on a monthly basis on actually coming in. That doesn't seem to be consistent with what the governor is saying. The LAO, they had just put out a report looking at actual income tax withholdings, different number than what the governor was talking about. But again, that's not consistent. So there are some disconcerting inconsistencies. The LAO has said that basically there's a $15 billion revenue difference between their deficit numbers, and that I think in a very politically kind of statement, said that it's in the optimistic side of things. So the LAO will come up with a different estimate, and that will probably be maybe a bit smaller than the 68 billion, but it does seem that the governor is kind of pushing things here. And I think the reason to push it is he's hoping for a Hail Mary. I mean, this is a difficult budget. It requires someone to step up to the moment, to realize the gravity of the situation, be the adult in the room, and say, this is the amount of spending we can afford. This is what we can't afford. Here are our priorities. And in a sense, I think what he wants to do is basically, bet the rent money in Vegas. Even if you do win, it was never a good idea to do that. And the risk is that if revenues don't come in the way he's hoping, then there's a real risk that the larger budget hole, bigger fiscal crisis. And in fact, if that comes to pass, one thing I would be worried about when we get, let's say, to the May revision, revenues are not coming in well. The pressure to raise taxes are going to grow. And, that type of pressure, will he stand up to the legislature and not implement really destructive tax increases? That becomes the risk the more we kind of kick the can down the road with these things. But I think what he's hoping for is a revenue surge. The stock market's doing well. Maybe capital gain realizations will shoot up, and he'll be bailed out. Again, is that possible? It's always possible. It's certainly not the fiscally responsible thing to do at this moment.
Wayne, in an op-ed that will soon be published, you make the case that the news about massive budget deficits this year and into the future reveals that there is a deeper rot in our state's budget system when it comes to overspending. So walk our listeners through how, in your view, this year's budget is much more about the state having a spending problem rather than a volatile revenue problem.
Oh, absolutely. I think this is something that's incredibly important to understand because this pattern goes all the way back to the 1970s. I mean, you talk about learning from history so we won't repeat the same mistakes, and we just refuse to. Now, and obviously they're interrelated in terms of the revenues and the spending, but what we have is a very volatile economy. We have a volatile economy, which can be good. I mean, Silicon Valley, pays off really well in good times, but when you're swinging for the fences, you'll have you strike out, and that's okay. That's the way that innovations occur. That's the way the private sector moves forward. But when you have that combined with our steeply progressive tax system, what we've done is we've created these revenue surges during the good economic times. And the problem is that politicians consistently, and Governor Newsom has followed this pattern to a T, they eagerly spend that money coming in. It's as if you're working on commission, so you have a small salary, but the big commissions, you spend, when that commission comes in, you spend as if that's your monthly salary when obviously that commission is gonna vary, and so you really can't spend to that level. Well, that's what we're doing. Revenue surging during the good time. We overspend on that, which drives up our expenditures to unaffordable levels, and eventually things then come back down to earth. Right, the economy sputters. It's what happened. But when that happened, our revenues crash. Right, that's exactly what happened here. Economy went down a bit. The stock market didn't perform well. Revenues crashed because that level of spending wasn't sustainable. What I like to say is it wasn't affordable. And that's the question that politicians never ask themselves. What size of government is affordable? Basic question, we never ask it. But what you basically see is that spending kind of goes up around 8.5% of personal income, maybe a bit higher, but then it drops back down to somewhere between 7.5% and 8%, which here in California, a bit high nationally, but it seems to be the level that we're kind of sustainable, and you can call it affordable in terms of California might be higher than it should be, but it's certainly shown ourselves to be affordable. Well, Governor Newsom has just followed this pattern, right? Just 2 years ago, he was talking about his $100 billion California comeback plan. He was spending like a drunken sailor. He'd make a drunken sailor blush. He was spending so much. And that has brought our current spending up to about 9.5% of our income. So as opposed to being 8%, it's all the way up to 9.5%. That's the problem. So now we're up at this level of spending, which is just not consistent with the long-term revenues that we have. And so we're going to crash down. And if history is a guide, we're going to crash down to about 8% of our income, which is about 1.5 percentage points below where we are now. That's kind of the pattern that we consistently follow. We're not getting off of that pattern. We're not even recognizing it. We're just saying, oh, there's a deficit. Let's take the spending to future years and play games. And that's just not good for our long-term fiscal sustainability.
So, given your argument that legislators and the governor must focus more on strictly controlling spending if we're going to get to a more affordable annual level, what are some examples of ways that the state can, as you suggest, do better with less?
I do think that is really an important mantra for the state, right? Do better with less. There's a lot of examples. Something I've been looking at a lot lately is the homelessness crisis. So I'll use that as the example, and it is a perfect example. Right now, the governor, his approach is called housing first, right? Well, he wants to put people in a permanent home, and from there, he feels like that's the right platform to help somebody address the underlying causes that drove them into homeless, or is keeping them homeless. Problem is it's just exceptionally costly. I mean, take Los Angeles, which is really the heart of the homeless crisis here, right? Providing one homeless person one affordable home costs $600,000 on average. And that doesn't even include with support services, which is going to actually help that person keep themselves in the home, right? Because if you're homeless because you have an addiction, if you don't address that underlying addiction, putting someone in a home isn't going to change the situation. So we need to think different. We need to be more innovative about this. A place that Tim, you and I went to go visit in San Francisco called Dignity Moves. They're not the only ones out there doing this, but they exemplify the type of innovative thinking we need to do. And what they approach the problem, they say, look, these permanent homes are they're too expensive, they take too long. We're not going to solve the problem by trying to build $600,000 homes with 190,000 people who are homeless. Putting into our budget crisis that we're dealing with, we don't have the money. We can't afford to build that, let alone the time delays that it would take. So what Dignity Move they do, they focus on temporary housing. And what's amazing about their part of the solution is that they can provide a really private, comfortable, temporary place for somebody that they can move them off of the street, put them into housing, private, and provide that necessary support services. And they can do all of that for about $50,000 per person. So they can do that for $50,000 per person, not $600,000. So we can cut the budget in half in theory and still serve 6 times the number of people, which would actually help significantly address our homelessness crisis while being fiscally responsible. And that's when we're talking about doing better with less. I think that's the perfect example. Where is the waste? Where are we being ineffective? Not budget based on intentions, but budget based on outcome, budget based on the idea that spending money is not the objective. The objective is to achieve something. And if we can help more people, multiples of people address in homelessness and do it for half the budget, that is a better a much more intelligent way of addressing the problem than saying, oh, if I care about homelessness, I'm going to bankrupt the state. It's a fiscally irresponsible approach. And it's also an irresponsible approach in terms of actually achieving our goals.
Of course, there are more than just spending cuts in the Newsom budget. This is the first year where the state has taken any significant amount out of the rainy day fund, which has long been a priority for fiscal conservatives. So naturally, there are going to be some fund shifts, delays, and other gimmicks. So looking at Newsom's plan, do you think the governor's use of these are appropriate, or are they really just a substitute for making the tough choices to bring spending down to a more affordable level?
Well, the gimmicks and budget shifts, they never make sense. Maybe I shouldn't say never. They would only make sense if you really need a breather, but they really need to be last resorts, and we really shouldn't be going down that road. These budget gimmicks are just ways of keeping spending higher than we can afford, and they make no sense. When you talk about using the reserve funds, that's appropriate because it's there. Right, it's called a rainy day fund, and it's raining, so there is undoubtedly logic to using those. But the problem is that we should be using the rainy day funds in conjunction with a plan that leads us to long-term sustainability. In other words, the reserves are supposed to be a bridge to get us to a more stable budget position. It's ineffective if we're using it as a means of, well, we want to keep spending up and we'll see what things are next year, but at least we can keep spending this year. I mean, that's, again, budgeting in the hope that we'll get another revenue surge next year is fiscally irresponsible. And so if we're using the reserve funds just for that purpose, what's then going to happen is we're going to have the same problem next year. The fund's going to be half the level or less than half the level. And the problem is going to be as large or potentially larger. So that's I guess, not that it's inappropriate to use a rainy day fund. It's completely appropriate. It's just, what are we going to be doing to ensure that we're addressing the situation this year, not kicking the can down the road?
So liberals in the legislature will surely howl at, even the amount of cuts that Governor Newsom has proposed. And as they have in the past, they're surely going to talk about revenue, and they're going to propose a host of new tax increases this year, apart from the controversial wealth tax proposal. They've in the past, they've talked about extending sales taxes to services and a new split roll property tax scheme and increasing top rates. Now, Governor Newsom's been pretty clear that he is rejecting new taxes. Well, maybe as we close here, we should educate the proponents of higher taxes to address our budget problems. You've argued and have shown in the past that raising taxes now would actually bring in far less revenue than the proponents of these ideas claim. So maybe give them a little taste of why that is.
Absolutely. And I should, because I've been very critical of the governor, give him a shout out that his statement that we're not going to raise taxes. I mean, that deserves credit. That is the right approach. And so, giving credit where credit is due, rejecting new taxes is the right thing to do. In terms of the impact, there's an old saying that taxes don't redistribute income, they redistribute people. And that's never been more applicable than it is in California today. And, I think consider someone that's in the top tax bracket, right? They're obviously doing incredibly well. But between the federal and state income taxes, that family is actually facing a tax rate that's well over 50%. So, the government is essentially the senior partner in their private life, their private business, because more than half of the money that they earn goes to the government. I mean, generally, if they're going to take more than half, like, I'm going to work all this time and get less than half. I mean, that's a huge burden, but it also shows the huge disincentive that somebody has. And, you ask, why are people moving to Florida? Or why are people moving to Texas? Well, if you're in the top tax bracket, and let's say you're doing incredibly well, you're earning $10 million in taxable income, just to keep numbers round, right? Then, ignoring the complexities, you're getting, let's say, $1.3 million tax bill every year. And for $1.2 million, I went online to realtor.com and I found this beautiful home in Fort Worth, Texas. Beautiful white brick home on 3 acres of property, 4-car garage, 5 bedrooms, 5.5 baths, 4,500 square feet. And it's a bit over $1 million. So with the tax savings, because Texas has no income tax, with the tax savings that I would have from 1 year of not being a California resident, I can buy a beautiful home. I mean, a 4-car garage. I can buy a beautiful home in Texas. And by the way, the rest of my cost of living will be a lot cheaper. And now I'm saving $1.3 million a year. I mean, that incentive to leave. I mean, you ask yourself, why are so many people, why for the first time is California losing population? And I think, that in and of itself describes it, is that you're putting people in just a financially untenable position. They're going to go and, save $1 million a year by switching elsewhere. And by the way, that doesn't just apply to the super rich. If you're, trying to make it in California, you can earn an income which would be middle class, upper middle class elsewhere, and you're essentially poor because of how high housing costs are, energy costs are. All of these different just basic necessities are so expensive in California. So that incentive is a very strong, powerful kind of force. And that's why, when you talk about raising taxes, what the problem is that you're going to just increase those disincentives, decrease economic activity. When you decrease economic activity, you're decreasing the tax base. A higher rate on a smaller base, you're certainly not going to get the resources that you were hoping for. And depending upon kind of the rates, you could actually get very minimal increase, if any at all.
And now next up is Lance Izumi, Senior Director of Education. And education is always one of the biggest parts of the budget. And so this is going to be a pretty important discussion with Lance.
So Lance, K through 12 education is typically the most talked about area of any governor's budget proposal. And, this year is maybe no exception, although the dust up over how big the deficit is might overshadow the K through 12 budget. So based on your initial read of his plan, give our listeners an overview of what exactly the governor is proposing for K through 12 spending this year.
Well, Tim, thanks a lot. With all the talk about the huge deficit in the state budget, now you'd think that education spending, which accounts for around 45% of the budget, would take a hit. But when you actually look at the numbers, education spending still remains at a near all-time high. If you look, for example, at 2019-20 fiscal year, which was the last pre-pandemic budget, state general fund spending for K-12 education and the community colleges was $79 billion. In the budget that Governor Newsom just proposed, funding for K-12 in the community colleges is slated for $109 billion, which is a staggering $30 billion more than in 2019-20. So to put this number in perspective, that $30 billion increase in education spending is almost as large as the entire budget deficit that Newsom claims the state is facing this year. But we also have to remember that the state general fund spending is not the whole story when it comes to education funding. There are other funds that are earmarked for education, such as funding from the federal government. If you add up all of the funding for education in California from all sources, then our education spending total comes to $127 billion, which is $18 billion more than just state general fund education spending. So another way to look at this, Tim, is to look at spending on a per pupil basis. If you look at education spending from all state and federal funding sources, California spent about $17,400 per student in 2019-20. Now compare that to Newsom's 2024-25 budget proposal, where he plans to spend $23,500 per pupil, which is a 35% increase since the budget just 5 years ago. Now, the bottom line, though, is we're spending all this money and we're not getting bang for our buck. And now, if you look in 2019, 29% of California 8th graders tested proficient in math. A bad mark, a bad total. But you look at 2022, just 23% of state 8th graders tested proficient, a decrease of 6%. And Newsom is proposing $13 billion for learning loss and learning recovery, but the money he's already spent in these areas have not worked. So one of the things that Newsom proposes in this budget is to give schools a way to keep on getting funded even if students are chronically absent. California has one of the highest rates of chronic absenteeism in the nation, with 30% of students being chronically absent from their schools. Under Newsom's proposal, schools can offer Saturday schools or after-school programs, and they would be exempt from minimum day requirements. Yet there's no indication that these programs will be geared to why these students are absent in the first place. If the teaching in California public schools is ineffective and doesn't meet the needs of students, then simply having a Saturday school filled with more of the same isn't going to solve the absenteeism crisis.
We always see the governor puts out his budget announcement, and then you get the reaction. And you always see on education, teachers' unions and the spending lobby in Sacramento, they will go around crying and claiming that the sky will fall if K through 12 education isn't given massive spending increases each year, or heaven forbid, actually has to sustain some cuts. But, I think it's been proven that how you spend in K through 12 education is much more important than how much you spend. So given the state's severe budget problem, and given the fact, as Wayne just talked about, that we're not, there's not nearly enough spending reductions to meet the moment, as a Governor Newsom might say, what are some ways that the governor and lawmakers could look at to reduce education spending without negatively impacting the classroom?
Well, as you say, Tim, how tax dollars are spent is more important than how much money is spent. Take, for example, the wide funding disparity between regular public schools and charter schools in California. Take Oakland, for example. Regular public schools receive more than $21,000 per student, while charter schools in Oakland receive less than $14,000 per student, a more than $7,000 difference. Yet, despite receiving less funding, charter schools in the Oakland area do more for underrepresented minority students, such as African Americans. In Alameda County, where Oakland is located, African American charter school students outperform African American students in regular public schools on state reading and math tests. Also, fewer African American charter school students are chronically absent, and more are prepared for college and careers. In fact, the proportion of African American charter school students in Alameda County taking college prep courses in high school is double the percentage of African American students in regular public schools in that county. So the lesson is that you don't need to spend huge amounts of money to get excellent results if you spend your resources wisely, as you say. Unfortunately, the state does not spend our tax dollars wisely, and we therefore get poor student outcomes despite bigger and bigger education budgets. So take Newsom's universal preschool program, for example. $2 billion has been poured into this program, yet research by Vanderbilt University has found that the state pre-K program in Tennessee resulted in children having lower test scores, more learning disabilities, and more discipline problems. And there's no reason to think that California will be any different. Also, the budget proposes funding to implement the controversial California mathematics framework, which has been harshly criticized by experts for reducing the rigor of mathematics instruction. The budget deficit is a good reason to rethink funding the framework's implementation. I would also be remiss if I didn't point out some head-shaking education spending proposals. For instance, Newsom proposes spending $500 million for green school buses. Given the massive crisis in student learning, I've mentioned the nosedive in test scores. Given the crisis in student learning, is this the best use of very scarce resources in this coming fiscal year? Also, too, the governor boasts about he's about to pour $4 billion into community schools. These are schools that incorporate healthcare and non-education services into their program. And the California Teachers Association, the largest teachers union in the state, supports it. But the important point is that there's little evidence to show that community schools actually improve student achievement. What they do, and as has been documented by a number of different experts, is that they have actually increased the amount of political indoctrination that kids receive through these supposed community programs in social justice, DEI, critical race theory, and all these kinds of indoctrination programs that are just upsetting parents at the grassroots level. And this is another way that the governor and the leftists who support him feel that they can shoehorn in more political indoctrination into the classroom at the expense of student achievement and performance and real student learning.
Well, Lance, once again, it sounds like Governor Newsom has an education budget that leaves a lot to be desired for. But thanks for your initial look at it, and I'm sure you'll be writing and commenting a lot more about these ideas throughout the year.
Thanks a lot, Tim. I appreciate that. Yes, I plan to be writing about these proposals, which have just come out from the governor, but which will now be debated through the legislative process and until we have a state budget in the middle of the year.
And next is Sally Pipes, who is PRI's president and CEO. And as many of you know, Sally follows healthcare, and she's going to talk about the healthcare parts of the budget. So, Sally, much has been made about California extending eligibility for Medi-Cal benefits to undocumented immigrants between the ages of 26 and 49, starting January 1st. Governor Newsom and his allies say that they are sticking with the expansion and making the case that the nature of California's healthcare system today requires this kind of expansion. So just how much will this expansion cost taxpayers? And what's your response to proponents of this program that we really have no choice but to expand? And how do you think lawmakers should respond given the state's massive budget deficit?
Well, thank you, Ro. This is the final nail in the coffin of having all illegal immigrants in California eligible for Medi-Cal. It's adding about 700,000 additional illegal immigrants to our Medi-Cal rolls. The cost has been estimated at about $3 billion a year. And, we know from past experience that people that live in other states or outside the country who cannot come in legally will move to California. So I think the $3 billion a year estimate is very low, and the number of 700,000 is low because we're going to see an influx of people. It's very expensive, but this has been one of Newsom's major campaign issues to get all illegals covered. It's interesting that under the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, illegal immigrants are not eligible to sign up for the exchange plans. So I think that, they really need to put a hold on this, like he is putting a temporary hold on the $25 minimum wage increase for healthcare workers starting in June of this year. So I think it's up when you have a budget deficit of $38 billion, and the LAO had said $68 billion. I think Newsom is definitely underestimating his thought that $15 billion in new revenue will come in, therefore we would be at $38 billion. We are already seeing a number of not just wealthy people in California leaving the state for Texas, Florida, Tennessee, but we're also seeing a great outflow of middle income people from the state. And then we have corporate corporations leaving. That includes, Schwab moved to Texas to Dallas from San Francisco. Chevron has just announced they will be moving out of the state for the most part. And Goldman Sachs just announced that they're really looking closely at moving their San Francisco operations to Dallas, Texas.
So, despite the state's massive budget deficit, that's not deterring lawmakers like Assemblyman Ash Kalra, who are determined to press forward with their push for a single-payer healthcare system in California where government healthcare would be the only choice. So this begs the question, if California can't afford single-payer healthcare in good budget times, well, how can we afford it during a massive shortfall? So what's your advice to legislators on responding to the push for single-payer this year? And what are some ways that we can lower healthcare costs in the state budget without harming people's healthcare or taking away choices?
Well, as we know, Ash Kalra has been pushing, he's the assemblyman from San Jose, he's been pushing for single payer for a very long time. If you go back to 2017, Tony Atkins was the co-sponsor of a full takeover of the government healthcare system in California. It passed the Senate, but as you know, Anthony Rendon, the Assembly Speaker, said it was woefully incomplete and it was off the table. We went forward 2022, 2023. Ash Kalra has tried twice to get a single payer past the assembly, and it hasn't worked. It worked, and it was actually withdrawn in 2023 with his Cal Care bill. He did say he is pushing for it again in 2024. Ro Khanna, who is the House member from the Silicon Valley area, he has said Ash Kalra has the only real single-payer bill. This bill will cost in excess of $300 billion a year. It's more than the total state budget, which Governor Newsom said yesterday will be about $208 billion. So the state cannot afford it. And if you look at the polling that we've done using outside consultants, 90% of people support the healthcare system that we have, and only about 16% support a single payer system when they realize that they would not have access to private healthcare, and that would be their only option, and that their taxes would increase significantly. The taxes, under single payer, under Kalra's AB 1690, we're going to cause a $12,000 tax increase per year for the average family of four. This is not acceptable in these times. And the fact that so many people are leaving the state, we're losing House seats in the state. So this is a terrible idea. And, people have to realize when government takes over the healthcare system, it means there will be long waits. There will be ration care. There will be tax increases. In Canada, where I'm from, the average wait last year from seeing a primary care doctor getting treatment by a specialist was 27.7 weeks. That's over half the year. In the UK, the junior doctors just went on strike for 7 days, the longest in the 75-year history of the National Health Service. They had 1 million cancellations of doctors' appointments, and they have a waiting list of 8 million Brits are waiting for care. Is it any wonder that private care is growing by leaps and bounds in the UK because that they have an alternative? We cannot afford, nor do the American people want, a complete government takeover of their healthcare system, as Ash Kalra, Bernie Sanders, Pramila Jayapal are all calling for. So if you say, what are some of the things that can be done? We need to promote programs like the short-term limited duration plans, which allow people to buy cheaper health coverage. The plans don't have to be part of the 10 essential healthcare benefits that are part of the Affordable Care Act. But unfortunately, California eliminated the short-term limited duration plans, which would help a lot of young people and people who are between jobs and have lost their coverage and they can't afford the COBRA payment. So we need to bring back short-term limited duration plans. We need to support association health plans where small groups can get together and join hands so that they can get better coverage with lower premiums and deductibles because the group would be larger. We need to expand health savings accounts so people can put money away tax-free in their health savings account and pay out of pocket for expenses that aren't covered by their insurance. So these are some of the things that we need to do in order to make it more positive for people in California to get good healthcare coverage and not allow the government full takeover of our healthcare system.
Sally, there's been a growing controversy over legislation signed by Governor Newsom last year that would pave the way for a $25 minimum wage for certain healthcare workers. Now, not surprisingly, it turns out that this is rather expensive to do. So, what does the governor want to do to address the huge cost of this program in light of the deficit? And what do you think Sacramento should do on this issue?
Well, yes, Governor Newsom signed SB 525 into law on October 7th of last year. What it would do would cover about 500,000 healthcare workers starting on June 1st of 2024. And that would be people who, employees who work in facilities with 10,000 employees or more. So on June 1st of this year, the hourly wage rate would go to $23 an hour, going up to $25 an hour on June 1st, 2026. As I say, it would cover about 500,000 healthcare workers. The cost has been estimated at $4 billion a year. Very, very expensive. And Governor Newsom knows, even though he signed that bill, that he's going to have to push back on this because the budget deficit at $38 billion cannot afford a 23 to $25 an hour wage for healthcare workers. It would mean that if this continues and goes ahead, it'll mean that a lot of hospitals will probably cut employees, making, longer waits for people getting testing and things and people getting into the emergency room because it's so expensive. A wage should be tied to the productivity of a worker, and people working in lesser positions in these hospital facilities, their productivity is not worth $23, $24, or $25 an hour. I think Newsom is probably going to get a lot of pushback from the unions because he signed this if he delays it and implementation until the budget outlook looks better. But I think this has to be done. We cannot afford these very expensive programs. Many more people are leaving the state, as I mentioned. Corporations are leaving the state. So the revenue is going to be even lower. So cuts need to be made on these very expensive programs.
Thanks so much, Sally. And finally, we have Steve Smith, Senior Fellow in California Reform, and he's going to talk about public safety issues in the budget.
So, Steve, now that you've had a chance to watch the governor's press conference and, go through an initial read of the governor's public safety budget, share with our listeners kind of the top line of what the governor's proposing in this area. And, in your view, based on your initial read, how do you rate the governor's public safety spending priorities?
Well, unfortunately, Tim, it tells me the governor doesn't really place public safety as a very high priority. Well, the PowerPoint in his press conference showed, $1.1 billion in spending on public safety, outside of the CDCR and CHP budget. What that really is only $250 million per year. And in a state with, 1.1 million crime victims, of which 2,206 were murdered, another 14,000 were raped, 47,000 plus were robbed, and another 128,000, actually almost 129,000 were violently assaulted, not to mention another 903,000 property crime victims. It tells me, $250 million to address that is not really leadership at the state level. It also tells me that despite his assertions that the prison population is continuing to decline, 1.1 million crime victims tells me at least some of those people should have gone to prison, and maybe it should have ratcheted up a little bit. So I don't know if it's the revolving door of, releases are occurring as fast as new criminals are committing offenses and victimizing people. But a declining incarceration rate tells me that deterrence is not where it should be. What's undeniable is that the Attorney General's own statistics indicate that violent crimes are up 6.1% and property crimes are up 6.2%, which makes California a national outlier because the rest of the country, violent crimes are declining and property crimes have increased at less than half the rate they have in California.
So obviously, when we're facing depending on who you believe, $68 billion deficit or $38 billion deficit, however you slice it, we're going to need to find savings in every area of the budget. So looking at it and looking what the governor's proposed, what are some ways where the governor and legislators could save money in law enforcement and corrections without jeopardizing the public safety of Californians?
Well, I think the best way to save money is to reduce crime. I was playing around with the Rand Institute's cost of crime calculator this afternoon after I heard the press conference and plugged in the 2022 crime numbers. And based on their analysis tools, that's costing our state $61 billion. That far exceeds total state and local spending on public safety. The governor likes to term his budget priorities as investments. Well, in my world, investments are designed to gain a return, a positive return. But the governor doesn't offer any data as to what our return on investment is and when we should realize the benefits of those investments. We're 10 years down this, reform period in criminal justice, yet crime is up. We're not spending any less on the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation than we were when the reduction in prison populations began. Recidivism rates are stagnant. They sit in the 60 to 70% range and haven't declined despite the billions we have spent allegedly on diversion and rehabilitation programs. In addition, the stated objective of some of these reforms is to reduce racial disparities in the prison system. Yet the numbers I just ran on Black incarceration figures show that it's actually gone up slightly over the rates that were in existence 10 years ago. So all of this kind of begs the question, how do we define success? And what is that return on investment? Do we measure it by the amount of money we spend or by the effectiveness of our programs? So I think California has squandered the greatest budgets ever placed in the hands of state government. And we're on track to squander yet more. From top to bottom, our leaders, our legislatures, and our bureaucracy have not been able to deliver on the promises made by those landmark ballot propositions and legislation of the past 10 years, including Prop 47, Prop 52, and Assembly Bill 109.
Well, Steve, I'm sure this is not the last that you'll be looking and thinking and commenting on the governor's public safety spending plan. So thanks for a few minutes with your initial thoughts.
You're welcome, Tim.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.